And then we'll hop right in. So today we're going to start talking about Judaisms. And I think it's probably better to put an S at the end because just like Christianity has many forms, same with Judaism. And we'll talk a little bit about different ways Judaism is practiced. But as I advertised, the first thing to talk about is why is it called Judaism and why the star? So the Star of David that you're looking at, the six-pointed star, to be honest, nobody seems to really know where it came from. I'm just to be honest, nobody seems to know. Some people will tell you it's a Kabbalistic symbol that comes from like the Zohar and Isaac Luria, who was a mystic thinker in the 1400s, but it's older than that. It shows up here and there. It's like on the Leningrad Codex, which is the oldest version of the Hebrew Bible we've discovered and predates Kabbalah. So I don't have a good answer. And Encyclopedia Britannica will tell you something like it showed up in Prague in the 1700s. Well, it did, but it's older than that. So I don't know what to say. It just has been associated with David, so that's it. Why is it a predominant symbol? Honestly, it's because this is how Christian people labeled Jewish people, and particularly during the Holocaust, you're aware, but it's an older labeling imposed on Jewish people by Christians than just the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. It showed up in a couple other pogroms against Jewish people throughout the world. So if you know the flag of Israel, this is it. The Star of David's in the middle, and it's got a blue line above and a blue line below. So it's really become more of 150 years, more of a modern symbol for Judaism. A more ancient symbol, which you can see if you go to Rome, is of the menorah, which is the seven-pointed candlestick that would have adorned the temple. Not to be confused with what Jewish people use at Hanukkah. That's called a Hanukkah. It's not a menorah. A Hanukkah has 9 branches. The menorah has 7 and would have only been used at the Jerusalem temple or at the tabernacle. So symbolically, these are things that you might see to designate our Jewish brothers and sisters. Normally, though, the star from the last 150 years. Why the word Jew or Jewish or Judaism? If you know your biblical story, once upon a time there was this guy Jacob, whose name turns into Israel, and he had 12 kids, and each of the kids becomes like the leader or the name of a tribe or a clan. So if you've seen Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, like there's a great song about this. Helps you remember words like, Gad and Zebulun and Naphtali and Issachar and Simeon and Levi, etc. Right? Well, one of the tribes is Judah, who's the name of a boy. And it turns out that Judah, if this is sort of modern Israel, Judah is sort of right here. That's the territory allotted to the son of Jacob, called Judah. And it turns out that all the other boys, they're all boys, sorry, get their land north of here. So there's Naphtali and Zebulun, and there's Dan and Gad, and there's Asher, and they all get these land allotments. But all of their land gets swallowed up by the Assyrian Empire in the year 722 BCE. And those people become the lost tribes of Israel because they're all gone. So the only one, well, there's two, the Levites, who have no land. They never had land. There's just Judah and Levi, and those become the kingdom of Judah. That's what they're called. And so when the Babylonians take those places over in the year 589, they refer to the territory not as Israel, they refer to it as Judah. And so Jews come from Judah, and also we use the word Judean. And so a lot of times, even when you're reading the Bible, particularly when you read the New Testament, you might hear when you read the Gospels, the Jews said this to Pontius Pilate, and it's really not a good translation. Those are people who live in Judah. Those are Judeans. who may or may not have any religious association at all with the Jerusalem temple, but they live in Judah. So we've kind of stuck with that. So keep in mind, right, the other tribes disappeared. So these are the ones who carry forth the Bible and customs and traditions. And so we still use this word Jews today, even though that's really 1/12 of the inheritance, and doesn't refer to the Levites, who essentially were the religious professionals. But there you go. There's the origin of the word and symbolic. By the way, I told you last week, please interrupt me at any time if you say that's wrong, or I'm missing something, or I still want to know blank. I suggested to you last week that can always be helpful to talk about gifted individuals when we study a world religion, and I want to do that in a couple of different ways if my slide will cooperate. There, okay. Before we talk about how Jewish people look at the world itself, gifted individuals are pretty easy, right? Of course, there's Abraham, right? The first one who gets called, and there's Moses, and then there's all of the prophets. And so if you sort of grew up going to church, you're probably very familiar with these gifted individuals. Of course, there is a God, and God's a pretty gifted individual in the Jewish tradition because God ends up making everything that is. And if you hear Sunday, I don't want to like berate you with this, but Judaism has a particular view of like God's identity that Christian people kind of have lost over the years. Part of that being that God as an individual has a name, a title that represents who God is. So in the church I grew up in, if we say God's name is like God, or God's name is Jesus, or maybe we say the Holy Spirit, or we say the Lord. But our Jewish brothers and sisters, as I mentioned on Sunday, believe that God has a personal name like Mary Ruth does. It's real tricky though, because there was a movement within Judaism, particularly that happened about this point like 2,600 years ago, that God's name was not a thing to be like taken lightly or trivially, and so it shouldn't be written or even pronounced. And this is still true to this day. So this is a little bit about a gifted individual that I'd like to offer you in a little more depth than I told you on Sunday. So sometimes you've probably seen this. Hebrew is a language that has no vowels at all. It has no vowels. And I'll tell you the history of that in a second. It's just a consonantal language, which means the reader has to know where to put the vowels based on a linguistic formula. So if you picked up a book of advanced Hebrew literature, this is still a language, I mean, the language has been reinvented. It was a totally dead language. Nobody even knew how to read it. It was reinvented in the late 1800s by Zionists, like you probably heard of Theodor Herzl before. He wasn't a linguist, but he said, we need our own language because we're our own people. So people stopped speaking just Yiddish, which was a blend of German and Hebrew, and reinvented a dead language that only had 10,000 words. And think about it, language with 10,000 words is pretty useless in modern parlance because it doesn't have words for computer or biotech or electricity. So they just made those words up. This is just what we do, right? So Hebrew is a relatively new invention and still has no vowels that are written on the line. All consonants written from the right to the left. And there's a couple of interesting things about this. Number one, Hebrew lends itself to mysticism because each letter is also a number. So the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the letter Aleph, which makes no sound at all. And you have to stretch your eyes a little bit, but Aleph means cow, and it was originally a hieroglyph for a cow. And they took a hieroglyphic and they stylized it into a letter that could be more readily repeated. So you didn't have to be an artisan to read or write. Now, this happened in most languages, it turns out. The second letter in the Hebrew alphabet is Beit, which means house. You may think that doesn't look like my house, but it looked like theirs. So on through the alphabet. And again, it goes from the right to the left. And it turns out that Aleph is a cow, but it's also the number one. There's another word for one in Hebrew, but each letter is also a number. Beit is the second letter, and what do you know? It can also be the number two. So you could say, I have bait dogs, and you've got two of them. And what's really, really interesting is you can take up, this happens in the later mystical tradition, you can add up the value of any word, and you get a new number. And that new number, you can scrap out into new words so that lines of text can get added up and make the Bible code. That's what Christian people call it. Jewish people wouldn't like us doing that. This is called gematria, where you add up number values of letters in lines or in phrases, and then you get new words, like a cipher, if that makes sense. And the text has kind of always lent itself to that. Okay, I promised I would tell you about this instead, though, because I haven't done that. Maybe I can just give you an example of a Hebrew word. So that's the word Adam, which we have proper the word Adam. Okay, this letter, the Aleph, makes no sound at all, none. This is the Dalet, which makes the duh sound, and this is the Mem, which makes the muh sound, right? But if you were just looking at this, literally reading from right to left, you get DM. Now, how do you know that those get A-class vowels underneath them? Well, again, because you grew up knowing that. It turns out, though, that sometime around the 1100s, when there were massive pogroms happening all over the world, not just in Europe, but also in other places where the Jewish community had settled, people stopped knowing the rules. And there was a widespread fear that people were going to forget how to read Hebrew, and then the whole tradition would be lost because nobody knew which vowels to put there. Now keep in mind, paper is really valuable because it wasn't paper, it was on veal skin, right? A veal is like an aborted calf because it has the most pliable skin, it can stretch, and that's where we get the word vellum from. So the scribes were trying to think, how do we preserve our tradition given that everybody seems to want to kill us for being Jewish? And we can't teach them these inherent rules. So they came up with a really crafty response, which is to add vowels to the text without interfering with the line. And so the way they did that is they just put little marks underneath them like that. So all of the vowels go above and below the line. That way they don't interfere. So you could take a line of text and just put some dots and dashes, and then you know what goes where. So sure, A-class vowel, this makes the ah sound, here's the D, here's another ah sound, and then there's the M, so we know that's pronounced Adam instead of Odom or something like this. Well, what's super interesting is these same people said, well, we want people to know how to read the language, but we sure don't want them to like misappropriate God's personal name. We don't want them to do that because, well, they don't know how holy and significant that is. And so they would be defiling themselves by accident. So the scribes took this gifted individual God so seriously that they intentionally put the wrong vowels to those letters. So you've possibly heard this word before. It's a Hebrew word, and church uses it sometimes, Adonai. And in the Bible, an Adonai is a lord, like a plantation owner, or like, the Duke of York. So there's lords in the real world. Well, what they did, the scribes, to make sure we didn't mispronounce God's name in ignorance, they took these vowels and stuck them with those letters, which is not where they go. And that's where this word came from, which you certainly have heard, the word Jehovah. It's not a Hebrew word. It's a made-up word by Hebrew scribes to make sure you don't put the proper vowels with these letters and in your own ignorance offend God by pronouncing God's name in vain, which is one of those commandments, right? So this is a nonsense word, but it's made up so that, again, we don't offend the most gifted individual of all by invoking God's sacred name in a state of unreadiness. Pretty interesting tradition, isn't it? And so again, like a lot of people have used this word, particularly in the Middle Ages, and that's exactly because the scribal trick worked. And so this became its own thing. So this continues today, that our Jewish brothers and sisters, they don't go around writing these letters in Hebrew together. And of course, you have to write these letters, but putting them together in Hebrew means, as I mentioned to you Sunday, you've kind of invoked a quality that is metaphysical. And if you put those on a piece of paper or parchment, it now has a life to itself, so that the parchment can't be thrown away. It has to either be burned or buried. And the person who does it is in a state of ritual impurity and has to purify themselves. And there's ways to do this in the Torah. Even if it's a rabbi copying a Bible, right? That's what they're going to do. They're going to copy the Bible down, which certainly has that word in it. Because they've kind of defiled themselves with God's sacred name, they have to make purification. And you'll see as we go through here, the name is in some ways so gifted and special and holy that our Jewish brothers and sisters continue, when they read the Torah, to read it on a scroll, because they don't have to touch the parchment. Now, some people will tell you, oh, they just do that because it's traditional. No, there's all kinds of traditional things we've changed. The other point is when our Jewish brothers and sisters read the Torah, they use a pointer called a yad, which in Hebrew just means hand, and it's shaped like a pointing finger. And they use that to touch the paper so that they don't touch the paper. So this is really interesting to think about the primary gifted individual not only being the creator, but that there's a unique gift to God in the Jewish tradition. And so our Jewish brothers and sisters do these couple of different things. They usually call God either the name, which is not a thing that they say, right? So they're calling God the name instead of pronouncing the name itself. Or they'll do this, which is an interesting trick. Christian people don't tend to do that, to signify, right? Well, that they're a consonantal system with vowels written above, but this is another really big clue that it's likely a Jewish writer or a Jewish audience. Have you seen this before? Anybody seen this?
I can't see. No.
Oh, it's G with an asterisk in D instead of the word God. Again, it's sort of a sleight of hand to get you to the same thing as Hashem. Some Jewish brothers and sisters might also use the word God, or they might say Adonai. And Adonai has become a substitute, even though, as I mentioned to you originally, Adonai could be anybody who has like title or wealth. Adonai has become, again, a substitute for the divine name. Now, in case you're wondering, it wasn't always the case you couldn't say this or write it. It wasn't always the case. Seems to have happened around the year 540. That's a soft date. But David and Solomon probably used that word quite a bit. In fact, there's a really interesting article that says in the kingdom of Judah, which I showed you on this map of Israel, this was God's personal name. But in the northern 10 tribes, the word Elohim probably was. Elohim is a word that we just translate as God, and the Bible's super saturated with it, and Jewish people use it very freely, just like they would use this word or that. But it's interesting to think that if you're in the north, that might have been the equivalent to that. But since those all people got wiped out, then it's okay. I don't know if a Jewish person would love that I told you that, but anyway, I read a book about that. It seemed like a good book. when we talk about Judaisms, there's going to be different attributes and qualities attributed to God too. So God, the gifted individual, God, the creator, that's going to be really important to mention in a second when we talk about attributes of God. Looks a little different in Jewish mystic traditions like the Kabbalah. And anybody know about this? Madonna said she belonged to the Kabbalah, which you can't. Women can't do it for one thing, and Madonna taught herself, and that doesn't work. Like it's a super secret society with initiation and stuff. So people who say like, "Oh, I'm Christian and I know all about the Kabbalah," no, you don't. you read a book about it, but it doesn't work like that. It works through mentorship and kind of like Masonic gilding secrets that happen in back rooms, because it's like mystic secret religion. It is. But there are some general principles of Kabbalah that are interesting. You can read about these in the book called the Zohar, which is kind of the mystical textbook for the Kabbalah. And some of it's really, really neat. It's particularly when we talk about God as a gifted individual and about the cosmology, which is the first thing I've got up here, which I haven't even talked about yet. Things like in the beginning, the universe was so full of God that there was no room for the world. None. And in fact, God's presence was this thing called the Ein Sof, which was like full of just emptiness. This is a really interesting idea, that God's presence was also empty. So there could be no creation because there was no room for it. So what God did is withdrew. God withdrew God's self or presence enough that there could be a thing. And in that withdrawing, this is sort of like a pregnant woman makes room in her body for a fetus, and not just gives it space, but also gives it nourishment and life. This is a very Kabbalistic image of like God, the pregnant woman. But also in the withdrawing, God's light got put in little vessels to carry it away. And the problem is those vessels weren't real strong, so they broke. And this sort of broke God's presence in the world. And this is why there's human beings, so we can put it back together. So just to give you an example, that's a Kabbalistic understanding of God. You could be an Orthodox Jew with a Kabbalistic understanding, right? You could be both. You could also be a Reformed Jew with a Kabbalistic understanding, but you could also be one of those Orthodox or Reformed Jews and not share the Kabbalistic understanding that I just gave you at all. This is why we have to talk about Judaisms, plural, right? But God is gifted individual, the creator. This is an interesting thing that we don't always get, and it's super important for God's cosmology in the Bible. In Hebrew, there's only one individual that can create, and that's God. So humans can make things, we can do things, but we cannot create things. Why does that matter? It matters cosmologically. When God creates the world and calls it good, it is. And we can't change that. We can make it not good, but we can't change the fundamental elemental structure of goodness in the universe. So this is a big contrast with this guy you probably heard of, St. Augustine. We'll talk about him in a couple of weeks when we get to Christianity, who says people are bad. Well, if you're Jewish, no, you're not. People are basically good. And you probably know this from European history. There's these three guys. There's Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in his book Emile talks about if a person was raised by wolves, they would be very good because wolves won't corrupt our goodness. It's society that does that. You've probably heard of this guy, Jean Locke, who says we're a blank slate or a tabula rasa. So we're born morally neutral, and then we either go up or down. And then there's this real famous guy, Thomas Hobbes, who says people are just evil. Yeah. So good, neutral, evil. Our Jewish brothers and sisters go there. St. Augustine went there. The U.S. Constitution went there. So God as gifted individual made really good stuff that is up for us not only to be stewards of, but also to enjoy. So sure, we're prone to making mistakes. Human beings make mistakes. That's okay. We're still inherently good, says Judaism. Really interesting thing that happens when we talk about biblical things. So God creates everything. That's a clear message in Genesis. And like this affects a little bit about how Jewish people understand things like, well, cancer and mosquitoes, because we may not like those things and we may say that they're evil, but biblically speaking, God made those things. They weren't made by like a devil figure, or like they didn't happen because somebody ate an apple. Like the view is God made cancer cells and God made plate tectonics. And those things in God's point of view are good things, even if they are sometimes inconvenient for us. A little bit different understanding, right? Than we sometimes share. It's important to say up front that if you've read Genesis 1, it starts. You know how it goes? Some translations say in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. It turns out in Hebrew, it doesn't say that. It says in beginning. So what's missing in Hebrew is the definite article. What's really interesting when we talk about Judaism's plural is that there's a debate that is not ever resolved. Jewish people don't like resolving debates; they like having them. This is this is very much an element of what it means to be Jewish. Is you disagree, you're going to always disagree, and then you're going to come back and do it some more. So you don't disagree and take your toys and go home. You disagree really vociferously, and then maybe you have a cup of wine and you'll see each other at the synagogue again next week, and you're going to disagree, and you know you're going to disagree next week, like you know that, but you're going to do it. And it's really interesting just from the very beginning. Does the Bible talk about the beginning of what we know or the beginning of everything that is? And it depends which rabbi you read. And just to give you an example, a lot of rabbis say, well, look, if you read the text really carefully, there's already stuff there. When God starts, there's stuff there. The world is formless and void, and there's water all over it. So that's the start. Some rabbis, and this is where we got the idea as Christian people. We got the idea from this guy, Maimonides, who's like an 11th century guy. If you're Jewish, you'd probably call him the Rambam. He's the one who said, well, God created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, which a lot of Christian people have come to share. But that wasn't a Christian idea, it was a Jewish idea. Out of nothing. A lot of rabbis disagree. So when we're talking about gifted individual God, right, there's a lot of different ways God's gifts are perceived. Out of nothing, out of a mess. Most of our Jewish brothers and sisters reckon time from the creation of human beings. So this is an interesting thing. How old's the world? Well, it depends if you're asking a geologist or a Christian fundamentalist. But our Jewish brothers and sisters don't care to date the age of the earth. They talk about the age of human history as we know it. That's an interesting dating system, isn't it? They certainly believe that God is not only gifted and made a thing, but that God intervenes in time, and they're not always sure how. And to be honest, I'm not either, right? I mean, there are some big events in Judaism that have totally changed. Considering the Holocaust is one of the biggest ones, right? Why did God allow that? Why didn't God intervene? Was a sort of a faith crisis for a number of our Jewish brothers and sisters. It wasn't the first time. Why did the temple get destroyed by the Babylonians? Why did it get destroyed by the Romans? Why have there been pogroms? Why were the Jews driven out of Spain? Like these were problems, but the biggest problem ever in the history of Judaism is the Holocaust. That's the biggest one. And the question if God's powerful and God's good, why? And we'll talk later about some solutions to that. I hope you're seeing this is about cosmology, but it's also about relationship to God. So not everything happens from necessity. Our Jewish brothers and sisters are not fatalists, even though there is probably a Yiddish word you've heard if you've been around called shiksa, which means like that's just how it was meant to be, right? So like there is that word shiksa, but it's also not a hard determined cold fate. I mean, there is this understanding within every branch of Judaism that we're not puppets on a string. There's the difference between being meant to be and caused to be, right? So just to give you that idea. And then the last piece about gifted individuals is this, again, so we've got God and all these people from the Bible, and I want to tell you a few more in a second. But then there's also this understanding of the gifted individual is the chosen people of God, Israel, and what does it mean to be a chosen people? A lot of times, if you grew up like I did, this idea that being a chosen person means, well, God favors you more than other people, and that is not the Jewish view of being chosen. That's the Christian view of the Jewish view. And it's really, really awful because it's our thinking, it's been our thinking, oh, Jewish people say they're God's chosen people, which means God prefers them to other people. So they're the future, but they don't even believe right. This is kind of what we do. Historically, this is what we've done. Jewish people will tell you in general, they kind of wish God hadn't picked them. It's like an interesting relationship in Judaism. Turns out, it's true in every branch of Judaism that we're going to talk about. Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. You ever had somebody knock at your door and say like, oh, you're Christian? You got the boat wrong. You need to become Jewish. That's because they don't do that. To let you know a little bit about this spirit, my brother became Jewish, and I was talking to our rabbi who visited last year, and I said, oh, like my brother became Jewish, and he went, he did? And that's a really interesting response, right? Because I would think like, oh, you want to be Christian? Great. Like that validates my faith, and I sure think this is right. And basically his reply was, I didn't really have a choice to be Jewish. I was born Jewish because my mother was Jewish. That's how it works. Your mother, not your dad, right? And there's a way of life that God has given the Jewish people that nobody else has to do. It's a real big difference between Christianity and Judaism, right? We get really excited that we're right, so everybody else has to do it our way. Jewish people think, do it your way, it's fine, but we have to do it this way. And it's burdensome. We don't even think anybody else should have to do it. We're not sure, even if you think you want to be Jewish, why would you want to? Because we have to do these things that other people don't have to do. And by the way, there's no understanding in Judaism if you don't do that stuff, you're going to hell. Not at all. Rather, to be chosen means you live under the Torah. You live under the Torah, and depending what kind of Jewish person you are, that could mean that you keep kosher 1 week out of the year, or it could mean you keep it 52 weeks out of the year. And keeping kosher is really inconvenient. And so kosher is the dietary restrictions, right? And a lot of times we say, oh, that's because ancient people didn't know that if you ate undercooked pork, you could get an intestinal parasite. No Jewish person accepts that. This is not like science they didn't understand. This is God's guidance of how to do it. So whether you understand it or not, it's what you do. But not only are there certain foods you can't eat foods that have been cooked in an oven that made those prohibited foods. So, just to give you an example, my brother comes to my home, he can eat nothing I make in my oven because my oven has had dairy and meat in it, and not usually pork, but before it's happened, right? And so the oven's contaminated. So So even if I made a kosher hamburger in the oven, it's not acceptable because the oven's contaminated. That's inconvenient. I hope you get it. It's really inconvenient. So our Jewish brothers and sisters, their response is like, why would anybody else want to do that? In some ways, being chosen is an honor and it's a burden. And this is the Jewish understanding of being chosen. From the outside, we think like, oh, it's because you think you're better. It's like, no, because this is a way of life we have to live. You're going to interrupt me with questions, right? Oh, there's somebody here.
I'm stuck on language. I'm just seeing a similarity between Eastern European languages and Hebrew. Because when we lived up in Chicago, there were a lot of people from Eastern Europe, and they had names a mile long, and we were lucky if there was a vowel here. And it was hard to pronounce, so they would say their name and you can repeat it back, but if they gave it to you on a piece of paper,
Yeah.
you were like, holy Toledo, I can't. What is this? So, is there a similarity, like in language between each?
Like, so I think particularly, I don't want to overdo this, but I think you might be saying, particularly like with a Slavic language,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, sort of. The bigger similarity would be between Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic, which are all Semitic languages. And so, like, consider that in Hebrew, if I wanted to like wish you peace, I'd say shalom, but in Arabic, I'd say salam. And if I said shalom, salam enough together, you kind of get it. Like, oh, it sounds like each other. I think maybe indirectly, but I don't. My understanding linguistically is not that Slavic languages are derivative of Semitic ones, even though those groups were in contact. Yeah, and part of that Eastern European thing, though, keep in mind the way that we got this modern Hebrew language, which is very different from Biblical Hebrew. It has to be. Biblical Hebrew has fewer than 10,000 words. The way we got that is mostly from the Jewish community that spoke Yiddish, which was not all of it, right? Yiddish is a mix of like, it's like kind of Hebraicized German, with some Slavic loaners, but I mean, it really is, it's German. But there's a whole group of Jewish people who spoke a Hebraicized Spanish that's called Ladino. So when you think about like the centers of Jewish thought, there's Jerusalem and Syria, right? But then there's this very strong Germanic diaspora, but then there's also like Cordoba and Granada. And there's not a lot of Ladino going around anymore because of the Inquisition. And there's actually a big, just kind of like you hear about strong roots trying to preserve like the Navajo language because native speakers, I mean, there's not many left, right? So there's this really big push to revive the language. That's actually happening with Ladino too.
Ladino is so very similar to the Spanish.
Do you know a Ladino speaker?
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's Spanish with just like a little bit of a Hebrew twist to it, right? I mean, it's if someone spoke Ladino to you, being a native Spanish speaker, you'd probably get like 70% of it. Tim?
You mentioned the Kabbalah, but isn't there one other tradition that begins with the M, I think?
Like a mystical tradition?
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm drawing a blank right now. I mean, normally we think of Kabbalists, or we think of, there's a group of Orthodox Jews who are also like very into Kabbalah, called the Hasids or Hasidic Jews. Those are Orthodox mystics, if that makes sense. So you can be Orthodox without being mystic, but if you're Hasidic, you present Orthodox, like you wear clothes from the Polish nobility of the 1800s, and you have like peyot, these like curls, right? But you also like do mystic practices in the synagogue and at home. Yeah. So that's where, again, that's sort of interesting to think through. Like sometimes we want to say, like, well, you're either Lutheran or you're Episcopalian, but there's a lot of overlap. Like, okay, so I'm Orthodox, but I could also be like mystical, or I'm Reformed, but I could also be, you know, there's more overlap than these aren't like discrete categories. It's basically what I want to say in terms of what books or customs you read as a Jewish person.
Do you think that we have very close Jewish friends, but they're very modern? I mean, when I say modern, I'm misusing that word. They're not really, they don't really practice a lot of the past, and that seems to be a common, they don't attend the church or the synagogue. They speak a little Ladino. Friday will speak some Ladino, but it just seems to me that it's not I don't mean to say a bad language or a bad culture, but it seems that way.
Yeah, so I hope you don't. I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to bend back on it, and I don't mean this offensively at all. But I've heard, and how do you quantify this? But I've heard a statistic that says something like 95% of Jewish people are atheistic. But I would tell you, I'd say a similar statistic is true of Christian people. I mean, just to be honest, right? Because, right, there's a way of life, and then there's also belief, and those can be very different things. And so, you know, more than anything, one of the unfortunate gifts of pogroms and Nazism is to associate Judaism not with a belief, but with a race. And that is with a race. Like Judaism is a race. Like you're a Jewish is an ethnic identity, not just a religious category.
Right.
I mean, this is what Hitler did, right? There were Christian people in the Third Reich who were related to Jewish people, and therefore they were Jews. Even though they had none of those beliefs and did none of those practices, it became like a blood thing. And that's true a little bit, right? If your mother was Jewish, you are too. What if I converted to the Catholic Church? You're Jewish. If your mother's not Jewish and you want to be Jewish, that's weird. Because you weren't born Jewish. Like I got a brother like that, right? He's like, I mean, I'm sure he's all integrated, but in his own head, like he doesn't have a pure Jewish identity because mom wasn't Jewish. So again, this is why we've got to talk about Judaisms, right? Plural. And oftentimes we do a lot of projection or oversimplification, like so-and-so's Jewish and they don't go to synagogue. Like, what's it mean for them to be Jewish? Well, I mean, probably about what it means when people go to church on Christmas and Easter.
Yeah, they celebrate Hanukkah. I mean, they have the certain.
I mean, we celebrate Christmas, and like so do Jewish people. And they don't celebrate Christmas because they believe in Jesus. It's because like it's a pretty tree and you get presents. Like that seems nice.
Those are the Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, so we have to get out of our heads that people are religious purists and they do everything based on beliefs, as if we did that ourselves. But I do think it's a fair thing that particularly since the Holocaust, like I mentioned, there's been a major faith crisis, but it's been dual. We don't know if we can believe in a God that allows the Holocaust to happen, but damn it, those Germans aren't going to get the last word. So we're staying Jewish, even though we don't believe in that stuff, because if we stop being Jewish, they win. So that's an interesting kind of unique place to be in the world. Okay, let's talk about sacred texts or scriptures. And you probably are, oh, and by the way, this is maybe really, really helpful to tell you. I had this idea that because I'd read the Hebrew Bible, I knew exactly what it meant to be Jewish. And let me just tell you that it has nothing to do with being Jewish. I'll return to that in a second. Because things have changed in 2,000 years. But let's talk about the scriptures. So this is not a thing you're gonna hear me say. I almost shudder to write it on the board, and I actually hate that we've done this as a church. I hate it. Because it implies out with the old and in with the new. Instead of the Christian Testament or the continued Testament or whatever. So I prefer, and you'll hear me say this in church, Hebrew Bible, not Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible, if you're Jewish, you probably just call the Tanakh, and that's kind of like an acronym. Because in Hebrew, T stands for the Torah, N stands for the Nevi'im, which means in Hebrew, prophets, and K stands for Ketubim, which means writings. And this is not only like how our Jewish brothers and sisters address the scripture, but it's also the key to which ones are the most important. So, unlike Christian folk who say it's all inspired, it's all the same, which is a lie, because look, you're going to read the Gospel before you read the book of Leviticus. Really, you are. If you're Jewish, the first 5 books are the ones that are the most important, period. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And can you imagine? Your husband has just told you he's going to leave you. So for comfort, you open the book of Leviticus. Yep, if you're Jewish, that might be what you do. Because that's the higher status of inspiration. This is the one that God gave to Moses on top of that mountain, right? Essentially, or Moses compiled it. Nevi'im is prophets, so it's really easy to think about Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then those other little ones, right? But that also includes Joshua and Judges. Not Ruth. But Joshua and Judges, yes. Ketubim are the lowest importance, and that would be like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, and Esther. You probably read some of these books. Some of you have probably read all of them. Again, that's what we have in our Bible. It is ordered differently from ours, right? So if you open something that is called the Bible, you'll get all those books, but not in the order that you'd get them in the Tanakh or the Jewish Bible. Like the book of Esther comes last. In ours, it kind of comes like 2/3 in before you get to the prophets. And why is it last if you're Jewish? Because it doesn't have God's name a single time in it. So it's at the least importance. That doesn't mean like they don't think it's a real story or whatever. It's just a different order. Why did we reorder the books? I don't know, but we did. So the order will be different. Okay, yeah, this is what's in the contents. I don't think I need to necessarily tell you about that. But one thing I do want to tell you about is something called source criticism. Is that what I want to do it? Yeah, I think so. This is the first thing you learn in an introduction to the Hebrew Bible class in any accredited school that I know. It's called the documentary hypothesis as well. And it was a Jewish guy's idea. We didn't learn that, though. We learned that it was this Lutheran guy's idea. So here's the idea. Baruch Spinoza had the idea, which some Jewish people call Benedict Spinoza because they didn't think this was a good idea. Julius Wellhausen is the one who got the credit in Christian circles. Julius Wellhausen was reading Baruch Spinoza, who read the book of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and realized sometimes stories happen in there like twice. And that's weird. Like in Genesis 1, God creates the world. Then in Genesis 2, God creates the world. Like that already happened. So what's up with that? Some people say, well, it's because something went wrong, so God started over. More on that in a little bit. But Spinoza said, no, they're two different stories. It's because people had an oral tradition before they wrote them down. So there was this one story and then this other story, and they liked them both, and they didn't want to leave one out. So they put them together. So turns out they say there's like not one author of Genesis. There's many authors of Genesis that get combined, at least 4. Usually we call it this. Now, most scholars will tell you there's at least 9 now, but this is 250 years ago. There's this one source that starts with a J, and what do you know? In German, J makes the Y sound. And you know it comes from the J when it uses God's personal name. How would you know that in your Bible? When this is in all capitals. So if you ever see that word, you'll never see it in the New Testament. If you do, you got a really bad translation, and you should get rid of it. Because it doesn't happen in Greek. It can't. This can only happen in Hebrew. If you see this, it means Hashem goes there. And that's the oldest one, because as I mentioned, they stopped using that. So if you read Genesis 1, how many times do you see that word? None. If you read Genesis 2, the second creation story and the way we've organized it. So which one's older? Genesis chapter 2 is older than Genesis chapter 1. Per this, and any kind of moderate biblical scholar there is, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, this is like the understanding, right? Oh, E stands for Elohim. Yeah. E stands for Elohim, which, as I mentioned, is the name of God used in the north that got adopted by the south. So chronologically, that's newer than J. D stands for the Deuteronomist. Now, let me ask, has anybody in the room read Deuteronomy, the book of the Bible? No. If you've read that, have you also read the book of Exodus?
Bits.
Here's the interesting news. They're about the same. Minor variations. Minor variations. And what do you know? That's what the word Deuteronomy even means. Deutero means second, and nomist means law. It's a retelling of the law. The one you already got, retold inside a different word. But there's a thing that Deuteronomist does that I put up here that scholars call the Deuteronomistic history. God blesses the people. They start disobeying. They get punished. They repent. God blesses the people. They forget. They get punished. They repent. Over and over again. Happens, the book of Deuteronomy says that's what's going to happen. Then you go read the book of Chronicles, which is newer than the book of 1 and 2 Kings and Samuel, and the author will even tell you a famine happened because the people did this with the Baals, and then they repented and God relented from the famine. So it's even written that way in the Deuteronomist style. You can find that in the book of Numbers. You can sometimes find it in Genesis, and mostly the clue is this thing's happening. And last is P, which is the priestly source. How many of each animal did Noah bring on the ark? You know this?
2.
2, the first time you hear the story. Did you know the story happens twice in Genesis? The second time he brings 2 of every animal, unless it's a clean animal. And then, do you know how many? 7. Now, if you read carefully, there's been no discussion of clean animals.
What is it?
Digest. Now, clean animals are ones you're allowed to eat. And we'll talk about that with kosher. So anything that has a split hoof and is a ruminant. A pig has a split hoof, but a pig is not a ruminant, so you can't eat it. A horse is a ruminant, but it does not have a split hoof. You can't eat that. A bunny is a ruminant. but it doesn't have a hoof at all. Can't eat that. A rock badger is called a hyrax, kind of like a camel. Ruminants don't have hooves. Neither camels nor hyraxes have them. Can't eat those. So that means there's 7 deer and 7 lambs and 7 goats and 7 steers and 7 water buffaloes, but 2 bunnies. In the first story, there's 2 of everything. When you hear it again, there's 7, which, what do you know, is also like the perfect number, which that sounds like something a priest would think of. So this is where that sort of comes from. Maybe I've overly bored you with this. Sorry. And by the way, this Christian guy, this Lutheran guy, says, yeah, like that's right. So most biblical scholars agree. There's at least 4, probably more like 9. But this was again a Jewish idea, happened in the Enlightenment, and this guy was really wild. He kind of got banished. Anyway, he's a really interesting guy. Like extremely secular, and said because of this, the scriptures are a human product only, and don't have a divine product. Most people don't do that, but he did, which is just to say that there's different kinds of Jewish people out there, just like there are different kind of Christian folks, right? How we view this: did God recite this and we wrote it word for word? Did God give us an idea and we put it into our own words? Was this just like, you know, somebody like Wordsworth or Keating that was sitting around and had their own good idea and wrote it down and we said, that's a good idea, right? Those are different ways of understanding inspiration, and the Jewish community has lots of different understandings. No Jewish person I know of thinks God dictated it word for word, just like it is. Instead, inspiration was people put this in their own words, but God inspired ideas. I don't know if that kind of makes sense. Well, it turns out this isn't the only kind of scripture if you're Jewish. See, it turns out there's a tradition that when Moses went up on top of that mountain, God gave him the Torah. And this is maybe good to say. A lot of times we say, oh, the Torah is the law. This is really bad. No Jewish person thinks that the Torah is a law that they have to follow. They think the Torah is God's greatest gift, and it's a system of guidance to how is it that you live into joy more deeply with other human beings and with God. It's not a rule book. If you mess it up, you get punished. I mean, I guess that is the Deuteronomist view. Rather, like, I don't always know what's right. I don't always know what's right. Well, the Torah has the key. So the Torah is a way of life that's going to guide us as a people to deeper joy. So Christian people like to say, oh, Jewish people are legalists. That's anti-Semitic. I really want to discourage you from saying that. And that, oh, you know, that Jewish law, people couldn't do it. That's why we needed Jesus. That's also really anti-Semitic, and no Jewish person would agree with that. It turns out when God gave Moses the Torah, God gave 2 of them. Most Christian people don't know this. So there's the Torah we have, that's the written Torah. But God gave Moses another one called the oral Torah. Where's that? Well, Moses passed it down to his kids and their kids and their kids. It was an oral version. I'm getting ahead of my own slides, but that's just fine. I'm going to show you the difference between the written and the oral Torah in one verse, if I can. You probably know this. You can't eat a kid boiled in its mother's, what's the word? You said milk? Milk, right? Okay. You can't eat a kid boiled in its mother's chalev. You can't do that. Now, it's interesting. If the word is spelled halav, it means milk. If the word is spelled chalev, it means fat. Every cultural anthropologist and linguist will tell you it's fat. Because that's what makes sense. If you've read part of the Torah, if you find a bird's nest and it's got a bunch of eggs and a bird in it, you have to pick. You can eat all the eggs or you can eat them all, but you can't eat them both. Because if you did, there'd be no more birds left on the planet, right? Like you can't have mom and the babies, you pick. So if you ate a kid boiled in its mother's fat, you'd be killing 2 generations at once. So almost everybody will tell you that's probably the right translation. Our Jewish brothers and sisters will tell you, nope, it's this one. How do we know? Because of the oral Torah. Which is exactly why you can't have a cheeseburger if you're Jewish. Because that's meat and dairy. No, there's another understanding like, well, look, milk is life and meat is death, and we don't like to mix life and death. Okay, that's fine. But the oral Torah just says you can't have it. It doesn't say why. So there's little changes in interpretation that happen, well, because of the oral Torah. Maybe you want to know, where can I read that? Well, that's problematic because it was oral. No, a lot of this, and this is really amounts to tradition, is what we'd call it as tradition. Where did it get written down? Well, this turns out has been written down now, but there's more than one oral Torah that's written down. And the word we use is Talmud. And Talmud means study. So a thing you would do if you're Jewish is called Talmud Torah, which is studying the Torah. And this is so important that there's a couple of them, right? There's the Babylonian Talmud, there's the Jerusalem Talmud, there's some Spanish Talmuds out there, and they're not totally the same. And what's even more interesting about this is if you're Jewish and you want to read the Bible, just the text, you don't usually even do that. Here's what a page looks like if you're Jewish. This is so interesting. Here's the Torah right here. Shows up in a column like that. So let's just pretend this is Genesis chapter 1, and it's got some of those words. There's a second column on the page right here. And it has the Talmud on the Torah, which is basically rabbinic commentary about what you're reading. So keep in mind, you're not reading one thing at a time, you're reading 2 things at a time on the same page. And I'm not even done yet, but what's in the Talmud would be commentary on this. And what's super interesting about the Jewish way of Talmud Torah is, maybe this is about like Eve and an apple, okay? Which it's not, it's a pomegranate. But in the Talmud, what you'd have is Rabbi Gamaliel says that Eve was just really, really hungry and you know, she didn't want to go away do any work, so she ate the apple. So be mindful when you're hungry to not just throw all your values away. But then immediately you'll have, but Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Gamaliel can go to hell, because what really Eve wanted, right, is she wanted some excitement. So be careful when you've got excitement. And then you might even have a third one, which might be, well, Rambam says that this is really about, you know, Adam had offended Eve, so she was going to get him back. I mean, what's interesting is they don't agree with each other, and that's known, and you're supposed to read that they disagree. So you read the text, and then you read not only what people think about it, you read conflictual accounts of what people think about it. As I mentioned to you, you are hardwired if you're Jewish. You are going to disagree.
Yes.
Okay, so those are 2. Oral Torah is the Talmud. But then there's a third pane on the page that's called Gemara. The Gemara is rabbinic commentary on the rabbinic commentary. So the Baal Shem Tov said, when Gamaliel said this, da 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 da. But meanwhile, Isaac Luria said when Gamaliel said that, da 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 da, and they have nothing to do with each other. So 1, 2, 3 at a time. But wait, there's more. At the bottom of the page is something called Midrash. And Midrash is, again, if you've read the Bible, sometimes the story ends and a new one begins and there was no bridge between them. How did we get from that to this? Well, sanctified imagination fills in the blanks. So if you want to know how it is there's two creation stories, like how could you accept that there's two? Well, Midrash tells you why. Once upon a time, God created a human man and a human woman, and the human woman was named Lilith. And Lilith, it turns out, wanted to be on top. That's how it reads. And Adam complained to God and said, God, you made this woman, and she wants to be on top. So God takes Lilith, puts her in Egypt. Egypt is where bad things happen, and builds a wall around her so that she can't bother Adam anymore by her wanting to be on top. And then God starts over, and that's why we had Genesis 2. Now, it sounds like, wow, that's just like somebody's idea. Well, it was compelling enough, people wrote it down, and it's on the page. So if you're Jewish, you're reading 4 things on the page at the same time. No, your eye isn't literally reading all 4 columns at the same time, but they're meant to be in this constant conversation with each other. And you may say, this is crazy. Like, who would preserve that? Well, it wasn't just like, you know, I was bored one day and I wrote it. That might have been happened, but 300 years later, people still found it valuable. The Midrash isn't something that like Stephen King just made up to fill in. I mean, it's actually centuries old. If you've heard anything about the Golem before, the Golem is kind of like Midrash. Do you know the Golem story? The Jews are being persecuted in Prague. They're put in a ghetto. There's going to be a pogrom. They're all going to get killed. And a rabbi does this really weird thing. He takes God's name and puts it on a piece of paper and stuffs it into like a clay figure. And that's enough to make the clay figure come to life, and it kills all of the Christian horde. And the Golem says, animated God's name on a piece of paper. And then when they're done, the rabbi takes the paper around and the Golem falls apart. So this is a story about God's name preserving God's people in a really weird way.
So
You could
this is
say
like a in-depth study Bible, page by page.
it's super in-depth.
Yeah.
So to give you an idea, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, is like that thick, right? The Talmud is like that thick. The Gemara is like that thick. Sorry, I need to get even wider. Which one, anyway? The Babylonian Gemara or the Spanish Gemara, right? So these are different ones. And as I mentioned, if you're mystically inclined, you're also probably reading this book called the Zohar. This is where Kabbalah comes from, and it has some of these kind of mystical images for what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, yeah, I did put that up there. That's good. And it's always important to remember, for us, we're on the outside looking in, and we're going to be doing that on a lot of these that we look at. And there's kind of 2 ways to approach it. I mean, we can say, this is what Jewish people really believe, here's their history. And that's the scholastic approach. But if you are Jewish, you're going to read your scriptures more sympathetically, right? I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying. We can be critical and impose dates and archaeology, but if you're Jewish, your faith persists regardless of those things. I hope that makes sense. So as I mentioned to you, as a scholar, I can tell you that word should say fat. Sure should say fat, but if you're adherent, that word says milk. Now, it turns out as a scholar, it's like real weird, because that command, don't boil the kid in its mother's fat, shows up 3 times. So what, like somebody forgot they'd already written it? Or is this a device trying to say, is it really, really important? Or, as I mentioned, there's 4 sources at least, so maybe that was a strain and they didn't edit it out. If you're an adherent, nope, that's 3 times for a reason. It's trying to deepen the meaning each time. So the first time is at the literal level, right? The second time could be, well, my favorite is, not only should you avoid it, you should avoid profiteering off of people who combine milk and meat. So there's the surface read, but then each time it's repeated, it's calling you to a deeper level. Don't just I avoid it. Make sure I avoid people who do it, or I avoid people who profit off of it. And this is what rabbis say. That was repeated for a reason, and here's the reason. Again, if you're inherent, okay, there's one creation story, but then maybe Lilith messed it up, so God had to fix it. On the outside, no, there's 2 totally different ones, and they both had really good meaning, so people didn't want to lose one. If you're an adherent, we don't understand why it's in the Torah, but it is. So we just accept it's here. On the outside, the reason you don't understand it is because from 2 different traditions. I hope I didn't lose you on that. No. All I mean to say is there's 2, I don't want to say there's more than 2, but there's 2 ways we can approach a world religion. One is critical based on facts and history and dates and times, and the other is as people of faith. As I mentioned to you last week, really easy to be scholastically critical of Mormons. And part of the reason we're like that is because Mormonism is so new historically, that when you hear about Joseph Smith tripping over some gold tablets in the woods, that's just weird. That's so weird. And then he had to have glasses to read them, but then the tablets disappeared because he pawned them off. That sounds real crazy. If you're Mormon, that doesn't sound crazy to you at all. That sounds like the essence of your faith tradition. Keep in mind, our stories are weird. We just don't think of them that way because we've normalized them. But, talking donkeys is really weird. You read the book Revelation before? That's weird. Oh, it has some higher mystical meaning, or God wouldn't given us to it. That's only something an adherent would say. Somebody on the outside would say, you're nuts. It's weird. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Yeah. I think what I want to do next time is start talking about some of the historical developments and give you some dates and context, but I've probably reached super saturation point with you today. So before we move on and or close, let me see if I can mop up some of the damage.
Back on the previous slide before that one, it seems that Judaism is kind of fatalistic. You go from disobeying the punishment to obedience, disobey, keep going around in this circle, and there's no way to kind of get out of it.
Well, there is a way. Follow the rules and you get to stay there.
Okay.
Treat each other well and you get to stay there, right? You do. And keep in mind, that's one source. That's the D source, not necessarily the viewpoint of the J or the E or the P source or the other ones. But lest we think, this whole circle, this is a very Eastern idea, right? We found ourselves here before. It's Christmas. Didn't we do that last year? Yeah, we do that. We find ourselves in life rhythms. We do. I think that's very accurate. That the details may change, but the substructures, I've seen those before. That's why we have words like deja vu, right? Which comes from the Hindu tradition and has to do with reincarnation, which we don't believe in, but we adopted it to say, I've had that feeling before, right? In the original context, I've had that feeling before in a past life. But I think it's pretty fair. And look, I grew up Christian evangelical. I actually grew up Christian fundamentalist. And this is what we'd say too. Those twin towers, tell you why that happened, because of the NAACP. And because we were giving gay folks rights. So God punished us by flying those planes in the World Trade Center. I mean, never mind that it was like some guys that did that. But God let it happen to teach us a lesson. I hope you can hear that's scary as hell. That God would kill categorically 5,000 people to teach us something. That's real scary. But it also helps make sense of a tragedy. And some Jewish thinkers, not many, said that's why the Holocaust happened, because we were disobeying. Most people that have an ounce of compassion say that's just a disproportionate amount of vengeance, right? Like there's no lesson to be learned when you're eradicated in a gas chamber. You're dead. There's a lesson to learn when you skin your knee, right? Like you can figure that out. When you're dead, you can't learn anything. But I mean, look, we do this. We do this. Y'all may not, but we world people, we do this, right? Why is there a drought in Texas? Well, it's because the liberals are doing whatever. No, it's because the conservatives are doing, but we do that stuff. We do. And to be honest, there's some truth in it, right? We're living in a period, depends what you believe. You may say global warming and climate change all made up. You may say that, but if you say there's some probably evidence, well, geez, I found myself this summer thinking like, wow, we're living in a hell of our own making. Because not because disobedience is the wrong word. We've treated the earth as a commodity and it's at the breaking point with us. I mean, the earth's going to do fine without us. Like we all get that. Earth was around a long time before us, will be a long time after. But wow, like this summer was a tough summer, wasn't it? Again, we map this out differently, but we do like cause and effect. We do. When good things happen, it must be because we earned them or we did something right. And when bad things happen, what did we do to deserve this? Maybe it was something. Again, I don't know. So some people are more fatalist than others. This is why it's good to talk about Judaisms, because like I don't think you can categorically say, well, Jewish people think that, like when that synagogue got burned, it's because they disobeyed. Actually, pretty much no Jewish people think that anymore. They've given up on this because it's oppressive. But sometimes we do. Okay, well, if I didn't drive you nuts, I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Oh, yeah. Remind everybody.